Many people today say they would like to be spiritual but not religious. Religion, they say, involves debatable ideas about doctrines and dogmas, while spirituality is about our inner relationship to God. In other words, spirituality is less political. We had an air conditioner repairman who was into spirituality. He said it was putting him in touch with who he really was. He felt more centered, more serene. He slept better at night. But his newfound spirituality didn't seem to affect what he charged us. And that's the point I want to talk about. How our spirituality affects the way we treat others. How it translates into real life. All the great religions say there is or should be a relationship between the way we are connected to God and our sense of compassion for the poor and disadvantaged. Buddhism exalts a man who left his position as the son of a wealthy ruler to identify with the poor and the outcast. The Quran says it is all very well to bow to the east or the west in our worship of Allah, but woe to those who don't share what they have with kindred and orphans and poor strangers. And Christianity, my own religion, says simply that faith without works is dead. One of the key moments in the biography of Jesus, according to the Gospels, occurred when he took his three closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, up to a mountain to pray. While they were there, something happened to Jesus. He became transfigured as if his entire body were glowing with light. And they saw him talking with two of the greatest figures in Hebrew history, Moses and Elijah, who were both long dead. The disciples, stunned by this extraordinary experience, wanted to stay on that mountain forever. Peter said, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let's erect 3 temples, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, and let's never go back." But Jesus reprimanded him. He said they had to go back down the mountain because of all the poor and the sick and the needy people below. It was his way of saying that spirituality, real spirituality, must always be coupled with compassion for God's little ones. As a Christian pastor, I have to admit I was often disappointed by my parishioners when they forgot this. Many, even those who were quite spiritual or religious in a private kind of way, didn't seem to understand the importance of a compassionate heart. I remember a Thanksgiving Day in Los Angeles. We had a beautiful interfaith service at First Congregational Church. Congregationalists, you know, often think they own Thanksgiving since they were there at the beginning. Mayor Tom Bradley had been our special guest. Afterward, some of us were standing out in the late November sunlight, recalling the high moments of that service. Suddenly, there appeared out of nowhere a homeless man with blood on his face and blood on his beard and blood on his clothes. His feet were wrapped in plastic bags. "I have AIDS," he announced to us immediately. He had been mugged in the park the night before. Somebody had beat him up and had stolen his shoes and his money. He said he was hungry. We didn't have any food at the church that day, but I went inside and got him a cup of coffee, and I poured a lot of cream and sugar in it. While I was doing this, I also phoned a nearby hospice and secured a room, and I called a taxi. I took the coffee outside. The man, in the meantime, had seen a beautiful brooch my wife was wearing, and he asked if he might touch it. She let him hold it. And then he said to her, "My parents won't let me come home because they think they'll get AIDS. I haven't had a hug for a long time. Would you give me a hug?" My wife held out her arms and hugged him and kissed him as if he were a little child. The taxi came, I put him in it, paid the fare, and sent him to the hospice, where I knew he would receive a hot meal and a clean bed. He died a few days later. Ann and I talked about this as we drove home. Meeting that poor man had greatly altered our day. We'd barely got inside the house when I heard the phone ring, and a woman asked to speak to my wife. It was the vice president of the church's women's association. She had seen my wife hugging the homeless man, and she was outraged. "You have disgraced your husband," she said, "and you have disgraced our church." Now, this woman wasn't a bad person. She was very respectable, in fact. She was an officer in the Women's Association. She taught Sunday school. I'm sure she thought of herself as being very religious, perhaps even spiritual. But obviously, she didn't understand much about it. Spirituality isn't something we have by ourselves, by spending time with God. It isn't found in attending church or synagogue or mosque. In all our religion, it is something that sensitizes us to the plight of others and helps us to reach out to them in simple love and generosity. When I think of somebody truly spiritual, I think about Toyohiko Kagawa, the great 20th century Japanese social worker. Kagawa learned about Jesus and it changed his life. But he didn't go to live in a monastery. Instead, he moved into the slums of Kobe, a great industrial city, where he knew he would find God dwelling among some of the poorest and most desperate people in the world. Day after day, he roamed the streets, helping people. He often brought them home with him if they were sick, brought them back to his little apartment and took care of them. Frequently, Kagawa caught diseases from these people. Once he even brought a murderer home, and for 4 years, the murderer slept on Kagawa's bed beside him, holding his hand to ward off whatever demons might be after him for the crime he had committed. Don't stay away from your church or your synagogue or your mosque. They have a lot to offer. But remember that they are only the beginning, not the end of what you're seeking. You go up into the mountain to pray, but once you've prayed, you must return to the valley to help others. There's a little story that has always meant a lot to me. I heard it years and years ago from a short, swarthy little man from Sri Lanka named Daniel T. Niles. Niles worked for the World Council of Churches, and he traveled everywhere talking about how people needed to help others. There was a man in India, he said, who had just been saved at a Billy Graham crusade and was rushing home to tell his family and his friends. As he ran along in the darkness, he stumbled over a blind man selling pencils. He stopped long enough to help the man gather up the pencils, and then he said to him, "I wish I could help you, my friend, but I have just found Christ at the Billy Graham crusade, and I'm rushing home to tell my family the good news." Dr. Niles paused, and then he said with a wry little smile, "He just missed Christ where he might have found him, in the beggar." Don't miss Christ or Buddha or Allah. Remember and mark it well. Real spirituality, true spirituality, always invariably issues in love and compassion.